Hello, Misha. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. We're so great to have you here. Misha, can you please introduce yourself to our audience a little bit? What's your family history? What brought you to the United States? What are you currently working on? And what's your relationship with Ukraine?
Yes, hello, Lizzie. It's very nice to be here today. Thank you for interviewing me. Yes, my name is Mikhailo or Misha Simonovsky, and originally I'm from Donetsk, Ukraine, which is in the eastern part of the country. But in 2014, me and my parents moved out of there because of the wars that began there. And we lived for 3 years in the city of Dnipropetrovsk or Dnipro, which is about 100 miles away from Donetsk. And then we moved to the United States, and I went to Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas, to obtain my political science degree for undergraduate studies. And right now I'm at UT Austin doing a dual master's degree in Russian, East European, Eurasian studies and global policy studies at LBJ School of Public Affairs.
For our audience who are not familiar with Donbass and the history associated with that region, can you please tell us a little bit about what happened in 2014 to 2015?
Yes, to understand what happened in between those years, it's vital to look at 2013 and the Euromaidan revolution in Kiev. And that basically caused some level of grievances in the Donbass region where people were not happy with the results of the basically a coup in the capital of Ukraine, where a pro-Russian president, to some extent, Mr. Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown. And he was from Donbass himself, popularly democratically elected. And people just didn't like that the fate of the country was decided on the streets, while people in Donetsk just quietly worked. You know, the fate of the country was decided in one square in Kiev. And so people went on protests. People saw what was happening in Crimea. The joining or annexation of Crimea by Russia went pretty smoothly. And people thought that maybe we can obtain some kind of autonomy from Ukraine at a minimum, or maximum. Maybe Russia can also annex Donbass. But those plans didn't come to fruition. And instead, Russia supported some kind of insurgency in Donbass because, of course, without Russia, all of this war that went on for now 8 years, basically the frozen war for about 7 of those years, would be impossible. Russia sent in some volunteers in the beginning, ex-professional military special services people, and they kind of helped the region to rise up militarily. Ukrainian military was not prepared for that kind of development. And in 2014, specifically in August, there was a Ilovaisk cauldron where a lot of Ukrainian troops got killed when Russian military got directly involved because the separatists were losing the military campaign. In 2015, there was another major development in February near the town of Debaltseve, where Ukrainian troops got defeated very badly. And after that, Minsk II agreements were signed in Minsk between Russia, Ukraine, and Germany and France as the signatories, where Ukraine basically pledged to federalize to some extent with Donbass being this autonomous region where certain rights would be given to Russian language, to some law enforcement functions, to local authorities. But Ukraine never really followed up on that agreement because it was to some extent suicidal for its political leadership at the time, but they still signed it. And when President Zelensky came to power in 2019, he promised to implement that agreement to stop the war, but he didn't actually do it, just like the previous leadership.
And, I remember this famous mantra from 1984, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Putin certainly has a version of the alleged history of Russian Ukraine, and the West has its own narratives. I wonder if you can share with us how you view the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and how the contemporary Ukrainian identity is shaped by the country's history.
Yes, so of course I come from the part of the country which was very closely related to Russia, so my view is somewhat biased. but I think it deserves to be heard because it's never really heard in Western circles. So personally, I don't think that Mr. Putin is fully wrong in what he says about the historical past. But where I see the problem is that he justifies military action by those words. So, for example, saying that Ukrainians and Russians are brotherly people, I think it's wrong to say that and then start a war with that notion. So of course, Ukraine, in my opinion, is an artificially created state, but then so is every other state in the world is artificially created. But Ukraine is unique in the sense that it was carved up by many of the Soviet and Russian Empire leaders into what it is today. Basically, today's Ukraine is a Soviet project, which was made from many different territories, which were never really together until 1922, and then 1939, Joseph Stalin joined in the two westernmost regions, specifically Galicia, which were under the control of Austro-Hungarian Empire for a long time and were the centers of Ukrainian nationalism, which was absent in eastern and southern Ukraine, which was under Russian control. And so that kind of set a bomb of slow action, which detonated in '91 when Ukrainian nationalists finally got a free hand in elections, and basically the whole country kind of shifted its narrative to be more aligned with this Galician nationalist narrative. But Ukraine is a divided country also in the sense that there's Ukrainian speakers and there's Russian speakers. Before independence in the Soviet times, it wasn't really a problem, especially, of course, post-war times. Donbass specifically was the industrial heartland that was quickly developing. Even after independence, Donbass was still growing, and Eastern country was providing the most economic might and the most hard currency dollar flow into the country, and so the country was sort of balancing between being pro-Russian and pro-Western. And in 2013, 2014 is when that balance kind of broke off towards the West because some people went on the streets and basically reversed the democratic way that was going on. Even how bad was President Yanukovych, corrupt, all of those things, he was still democratically elected, and that set the precedent. The precedent was also set in 2004, but in 2013 it was more blatant and was less justified. Yes.
Since Putin started this war, I wonder if you have had a chance to talk with your family, friends, and people back in Ukraine. I wonder if you can tell us a little more about what's actually happening on the ground. And you mentioned, Ukrainians are separated into different camps. They have different views, and the country's history is certainly complicated. But how do Ukrainians generally view the war, and how do they envision the future of the country afterward?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's a very good question because of course, as I mentioned, this war has been going on with some level of violence for 8 years now, and it hasn't really impacted most of Ukraine in a sense that it's going on right now, full-scale invasion on many fronts. So many Ukrainians actually felt comfortable for all those years, because war wasn't directly affecting them. So they were kind of like, do we have war? Do we not have war? What do we even have? We have anti-terroristic operation, and then we had the joint forces operation in Donbass, and of course, as you can see, like, it was prolonged, the anti-terrorist operation, and right now, of course, many more people are aware of the war in Kharkov, in Kiev, in Odessa, in Mykolaiv, in many places in Kherson, across the country. Everybody is feeling the pain. And I think the country finally united to some extent. And it's hard for me to say whether that will be permanent or at least, long enough. I don't know if Ukraine will finally get a unified identity. I still don't know. Most of the regions who are suffering right now are actually the regions that Mr. Putin claimed to protect. And he's not doing that, and he's bombing Russian-speaking cities basically across all of Ukraine, the cities that harbored some good attitudes towards Russia, towards Russian language, Russian culture, maybe Mr. Putin himself even. And right now they're being bombarded, in some cases occupied, and people had to move out of the country, move to the west of the country. So what is happening now, nobody is happy about that. Russia is not seen as the liberator. So in Crimea in March 2014, Russia was, almost without a shed of blood, they annexed the whole peninsula, and people were on board with that. Right now, I don't think that there's more than 10% support for Russia's actions in the territories that they control or want to control, simply because people don't want war, and they don't need Russia's protection to do Russian language activities, to go about their lives. Russia claims to protect them, to save them from some imaginary Nazis. There's very small amount of Nazis in Ukraine, and they don't control the daily lives. As to my family, everything is all right with them. My parents live in the city of Dnipro right now, but my other part of the family is still in Donetsk, which is under Russian control effectively, and they are experiencing heavy bombing and a lot of humanitarian problems, such as water problems. So I only have it about 2 hours every day, and the quality of water is really bad. And my uncle and aunt had to go underground, first time in many years now. And of course, city of Mariupol was devastated, and it was very close to our home. And I can only imagine what will happen to the rest of Donbass, all the little towns that Russia does not control right now, how devastated they will be. We have yet to see what will happen, but I think the Russian plan right now is to destroy Donbass, and they're doing everything to that end. For example, this morning I read that they cut off a major rail connection between Donbass and Dnipro, which is the most adjacent region. And they already did that about a week ago, a similar action, and they're bombing some oil facilities in Dnipro. The airport is already done. So Ukraine can't really reinforce Donbass from that direction. It's getting harder and harder. Yeah.
Right. It's really sad to hear those stories. Just one quick question. So in your personal view, how would you evaluate President Zelensky's performance since the war? And what do you think is the motivation behind Mr. Putin's seemingly senseless war?
Yes. So to answer your first question about Mr. Zelensky, I think that he has been an impeccable leader, but importantly, since the beginning of the war, because I think that he had a chance to stop this war if he went on some sort of compromise with Russia under the Minsk II agreements umbrella. But since the war began, because now that's all history, but since the war began, he has been a very effective leader. I think that without him, Ukrainian state would basically collapse. I think if it was some other president, for example, Mr. Yanukovych in 2014, when Euromaidan raged on in February, he ran away from the country and the whole system collapsed and nobody was there to defend the state per se and the democratic elections. And I think if Zelensky did it now, the collapse would also happen. Of course, Ukraine is not a centralized state like Russia, for example, but a lot of things still depend on the president and his charisma, especially. And I think the fact that Zelensky stayed in Kyiv in the hardest hours for Ukraine was seen by many people, even by people like me, who did not exactly like his policies after he became president, but supported him in elections, was seen as a move of a great leader, and a person who cares about the country, about its people, and about where we go in the future. Because if we take a stand now, it makes that we can make some decisions about our future without thinking about will it anger Russia? And regarding Mr. Putin and his intentions in Ukraine, I think that that he basically threw everything on the table with this. Russia's great power status is being contested right now, because he thought in his mind, and I don't think that a lot of Russian elites, whatever they are now, there's no elites, but they agree with him. I think that that he thought that Ukraine presents an existential threat to Russian Federation, in the sense that it will be like the front line of NATO in some kind of activities against Russia. But most importantly, I think that that what we don't see is the fact that I think Russian leadership over the years just got upset with the Ukrainians, in the sense that Ukrainians didn't follow up on Minsk II agreements, and they waited for Mr. Petro Poroshenko, who was president before Zelensky, to implement Minsk II agreements. He didn't. Then Zelensky came to power. He promised to bring peace. They waited for about 6 months, I believe. And then Mr. Dmitry Medvedev, ex-president of Russia, published an op-ed saying that we can't deal with Zelensky, and we can't wait for a new president to come too. So and Zelensky might run for a second term, and who knows what will happen in those years in between in regards to NATO. So I think that they just thought that the time to act is now. But personally, I believe that up until the last weeks before the invasion, I believe that all of those Russian actions near Ukraine's borders was just a part of coercive diplomacy, where they were trying to put pressure on the West and on President Zelensky to implement Minsk II agreements. But I think at a certain time we reached a point of no return, where the decision to move into Ukraine was already decided upon, and as I said, this war is a war for everything with Russia. If Russia can't just lose this war, because if they pull out now, they lose their great power status. So they have to achieve some kind of victory in Donbass to at least get some gains in this campaign.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Misha, for that introduction. Super helpful. As I mentioned previously, many of our audience are Chinese language speakers. Many of them are originally from China or still have families there. And as you know, the Chinese government's attitude has been under a lot of criticism. The Chinese government seems to be, trying to play both sides since the onset of the crisis, promising humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but also refusing to condemn Russia. I wonder if you can shed light on that a little bit. How do you find the Chinese government's attitude? Do you think it's as expected? Is it perplexing? Is it irritating? And how do Ukrainians generally view the Chinese government and the Chinese nation? Are we friends, foes, or something in between?
Yes, so I think that this kind of attitude is expected from China, just because China is a partner of Russia. It's not exactly an ally, but a partner. And of course, they would support Russia in almost anything Russia does. But I think that this war comes as close to what China would not support as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Putin made a mistake was going into war with Ukraine without any allies, really, because China is not an ally. It's just a bystander that that needs Russia for some immediate things. And I think China is walking on a tightrope here, because, of course, the Chinese claim to support state sovereignty and the territorial integrity because of Taiwan. And at the same time, they have to support Russian actions to a certain extent. So they're walking on a very tight rope here. And if China was a true ally to Russia, of course, they would vote with Russia on UN Security Council in the UN General Assembly. But Russia only got the votes of Eritrea, Syria, Belarus, and North Korea, who did not condemn Russia for this invasion. China and India abstained. Even Serbia voted yes to condemn. So I think that personally, I thought that China should take the opportunity to mediate in this war, because if China wants to become a hegemonic power, to some extent a great power, it is a great power already, but but many people in the world would see China differently if China also mediated in this conflict, because it presents a unique opportunity for the Chinese to do this, because the Russians are their partners and Ukraine does not perceive China as enemies. Many people in Ukraine still perceive China as a very friendly nation to Ukraine. I think Russia has about 2% support right now as being a friendly nation. The biggest support has Poland, about 77%. And I think China has the support of about 25% of people who think that it's a friendly nation. And I think that China could capitalize on that and increase its stature in the world by mediating in those talks. But I know realistically that it's not going to happen because of the structure of the Chinese system. It's just very sad that I think that China engaged in criticism of NATO. Of course, as I was saying before, NATO has a big part to play in this conflict, but I think that this war is purely Mr. Putin's making, and I think that China should have played a larger role, but realistically, I know that they couldn't.
I see. And speaking of other countries in the international community, what does Ukraine need from the international community in addition to the support it has already gotten? And do you find the international community's current response is satisfactory? Are there other things Western nations should be doing?
Yes, I think that we should not confuse the international community with the West, because if you look at which countries were on the front lines of implementing sanctions against Russia, it was mostly Western countries, while the other countries are sort of sitting on the fence and watching how this plays out. Some of them even support Russia quietly, and of course Russia can just rely. I mean, Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs claims that it's the West versus the rest. So I think that that we should be careful about what we define as the international community. Of course, the West holds a lot of economic power, as we can see, and it does a lot to help Ukraine, puts pressure on the Russian government. But I think that if it was truly international community, then countries like India and China would also play a bigger role in stopping the current turmoil. I think that the West should have done more to Ukraine, specifically in the run-up to this war. Develop Ukraine economically, because Ukraine was the poorest country in Europe. We cannot forget about that. Moldova was for many years, and then in 2014 it shifted and never came back after that. And I think just Ukrainians since 2014, many of us believe that Europe is some kind of savior, and that Ukraine belongs in Europe, and that we belong in NATO. I was never a big believer in that, but I know that many of my compatriots were, and I think that those hopes didn't come to truth, really. That the West, yes, they provided a lot of help, and there was unprecedented level of unification within the West, but at the end of the day, NATO didn't want to fight for Ukraine. Of course, they had no obligation to do so, but I think there is no country, even in NATO, who wants to be in NATO so badly as Ukraine wanted, except for the Baltic states, maybe. And I think that if the United States was claiming that this war was imminent, basically since about January, December of 2021, then maybe it would be wise for United States to warn Ukrainian leadership and give some concrete evidence. I don't know if this actually happened, but President Zelensky claimed that we didn't receive any intelligence from the United States claiming that the invasion would happen soon. And there was not a lot of diplomatic effort to try to stop this war. If this war would actually be this kind of brutal war, full scale humanitarian catastrophe, why didn't the United States do more to support Ukraine in this difficult time? And I think the good thing about this war, if there's any good thing, is that Ukraine will finally understand that Ukraine is on its own. And I think we can hear that more from President Zelensky right now, more realistic views about NATO. And I think that that's a good thing.
In terms of economic sanctions, have they been working in your view?
I think that they have been working. Of course, Russia did not expect this kind of unity from the West and this kind of quick response. So I think that the United States was kind of laying the groundwork throughout this time of intelligence leakings. They were laying the groundwork with European allies. So in case that something happens, we already have a plan established on what to do with Russia. But the thing is, yes, Russia is destroyed in the long term, but they still continue their campaign. So if Ukraine was not as strong or Russia was not as weak, then Russia could, achieve its goals in this campaign, and all the economic sanctions would not really matter anymore, at least in that time frame. And then the parts of Ukraine that would be under Russian control, or maybe the whole of Ukraine, would also suffer under those sanctions, because it would drag Ukraine to the bottom of the ocean together with Russia. And I think, yes, the sanctions have been working, but the fact that international community, as I said, is more broad than the West, does not really support those efforts in full scale. For example, India and China and other Asian countries, Russia can rely on those countries to basically say that we don't have to rely on the West. We can just switch our economics to the East. And I think in that sense, the international community failed. Yes, the West is unified, but the rest of the world is not unified. And I think that the sanctions will have a big role in Russia's economic decline in long term. But in short term right now, the war is still going on. Putin is not Putin has not given up. He's going to Donbass. And it's hard to see if Ukraine will win in that localized campaign. Ukrainians themselves claim that it's about 50% chance, because Russia is concentrating a lot of troops in that area, and Ukrainian troops face a big cauldron in the Donbass region. So I think that it's, of course, it's good that the West implemented all those actions, but I think that they could have done more to stop this war and develop Ukraine economically prior to this war.
Thank you so much. And Misha, finally, you're currently still in graduate school. Do you mind sharing with us your kind of career aspirations after graduation?
Yes, so I'm in the middle of thinking about my career. I went straight from undergraduate to graduate school. I didn't have any work experience. And for me, like, this war just presents another evidence that I should work in diplomacy, hopefully in the U.S. State Department. Recently, I received my U.S. citizenship, and I hope, and thank you, and I hope that I will be able to help somehow on some level, and that we can avoid those kinds of catastrophes in the future, because I think that Ukraine is going to remain a hotspot one way or the other in frozen conflict terms. But as we can see, frozen conflicts have this tendency to unfreeze, and so I think that there needs to be post-conflict management, and I'm hopeful that I will be able to contribute, because I have a vested interest in this, and I have personal experiences that tell me that it's the right thing to do.
Well, thank you so much, Misha, for this very insightful conversation, and I look forward to chatting with you in the future.